In 701 BC, the Assyrian war machine under King Sennacherib began a rapid expansion toward the kingdom of Judah. This advance created a total existential threat for King Hezekiah and his capital in Jerusalem. This specific geopolitical crisis is documented on the Taylor Prism. The Taylor Prism is an ancient hexagonal clay document containing Sennacherib's own annals, which detailed the successful siege of 46 Judean walled cities. Hezekiah responded with a pragmatic defense strategy. He dispatched caravans through the arid terrain of the Negev desert, sending Judah's wealth south to buy a military alliance with the 25th Kushite dynasty of Egypt. In the 8th century, political survival depended on strong military alliances. For a leader facing total annihilation, turning toward Egypt appeared to be the only responsible choice. The prophet Isaiah enters this crisis with a counterproposal. He rejects the Egyptian alliance entirely, identifying the diplomatic maneuver as a fatal illusion that would accelerate Judah's collapse. Isaiah does not suggest a superior military tactic. Instead, he argues that the cessation of all defense strategies and total immobility is the most effective defense against the Assyrian advance. Isaiah 30:15 contains the most concentrated and structurally balanced declaration of salvation in the Old Testament, outlining the mechanics of divine protection. This text forces a collision between human anxiety and divine order. Isaiah argues that the human instinct to take frantic action in a crisis is exactly what ensures destruction. Verses 2 and 3 describe Judah seeking the shadow of Egypt, a search for a political umbrella to block the Assyrian threat. Isaiah attacks this reliance with irony in verse 7, labeling Egypt as Rahab. In ancient Near Eastern literature, Rahab is a mythological sea monster representing chaotic pride and destructive power. Isaiah attaches a specific modifier to this monster, the Hebrew word shavet, which translates to sitting, ceasing, or being idle. Judah is draining its national treasury to purchase protection from a paralyzed god, a mythological beast that refuses to act. This idle Egyptian god stands in contrast to the Judean response in verse 16. There, the people insist on fleeing on fast horses, attempting to outrun their doom through sheer velocity. Fleeing at high speed toward an idle ally is a geopolitical illusion. Action taken purely for its own sake only accelerates the collapse of the state. This matrix shows the four-part structure of salvation in the Masoretic text of verse 15, centering on return and rest, alongside quietness and trust. This equation links survival to the cessation of self-reliance. The Septuagint, the earliest Greek translation, expands this formula. The Greek text introduces the word stenexes, meaning groaning or sighing. This addition gives the concept of finding rest a difficult, active psychological dimension. This Greek phrasing became a foundation for the early patristic ascetic tradition. Early Christian theologians used it to define repentance as an active labor rather than passive sleep. Biblical rest is the active, difficult surrender of one's own control. Isaiah 30 follows a symmetrical arch structure. The left pillar builds through Judah's flight to Egypt, while the right details God's judgment on Assyria. Verse 15 acts as the structural lock. The command to rest sits at the exact apex of the narrative architecture. Rejecting this stillness leads directly to the systemic destruction described in verse 14, symbolized by a smashed clay jar. The pottery is pulverized so thoroughly that not a single shard remains large enough to scoop water from a pool or carry a hot coal from a hearth. Without the ability to transport fire or water, the nation loses the elemental tools required for sacrifice. The failure to rest effectively ends their capacity to approach God. This rejection shatters Judah's spiritual identity. The resulting military defeat is secondary to the total loss of the nation's capacity for worship. Early church fathers read these geopolitical verses as structural precursors to Christ, a method called typology. Jerome connected verse 18's lifted up to Christ on the cross, while Cyril mapped the bread of adversity in verse 20 directly to the Eucharist. Cyril concluded that the bread of life is not gained through idleness. It is only accessed through the narrow gate of ascetic struggle and the cross. The sevenfold light in verse 26 was identified by Cyril as the spiritual illumination of the resurrection, which overcomes the darkness of the crucifixion. These geopolitical failures parallel the New Testament victory, showing the point where divine justice and mercy meet. Two silences operate here. First, the dead silence of the Egyptian idol, Rahab. Second, the active delay of God, slowing down to show mercy. Verse 14 promises total destruction, while verse 18 promises mercy. They sit only 4 sentences apart. This delay is a calculated period where God waits for human panic to yield to grace. He maintains his righteous judgment while waiting for the people to exhaust their own strength. God's delay in a crisis is not an absence of power. It is an intentional waiting for human effort to reach its end. Gregory the Great provided a psychological analysis of verse 21, which promises that your ears will hear a word behind you. This raises a spatial question. Why does the voice of the teacher come from behind them? Gregory explains that the voice is behind the runner because humanity has turned its back on God, running towards its own pragmatic solutions. Rather than abandoning the runner, God follows closely. He continues to call to their back without forcing them to stop. The moment a person stops their attempt to save themselves, they realize the God who was behind them was actually supporting them the entire time. The inability to stop running defines the human struggle. Salvation is received only when we surrender to stillness.